Hi, I'm Joseph Jones. I'm the Executive Director of the Harkin Institute for Public Policy and Citizen Engagement, located at Drake University. And today I'm going to talk to you about uh, vocational rehabilitation self-employment policy across the US and a project that we're working on to review those state VR policies. And I'm excited to chat with you a little bit about our work and in partnership with others who you may have heard of. Today's conversation is worth 1 CRC credit, and I am ready for us to start. So the objectives of today's conversation are to review what it is that we do at the Harkin Institute, talk to you a little bit about good public policy making and good policy making. We'll talk about the methods and research of our self-employment project, and then the areas of review that we're going through in this particular project on self-employment, and then the outcomes and next steps as we move through our project. First, I'll begin with telling you a little bit about the Harkin Institute and how it came to be. Many of you may know the name Tom Harkin. Senator Harkin was a member of Congress from Iowa for 40 years. He served 10 years in the US House of Representatives and 30 years in Congress, in the Senate. And once he announced his retirement, it was the creation of the Harkin Institute and the establishment of his papers in the archives here at Drake University that really began the next phase of the Tom Harkin legacy. And our job at the Harkin Institute is to help preserve that legacy. It's to continue the conversations about the policy areas in which he really spent a great deal of his time, the issue areas in which he championed for people not only in the US but around the world. It's things such as the Americans with Disabilities Act and the Harkin-Engel Protocol, and investments in public health, all that made his career so really remarkable, and that we get to continue that legacy through our research and work at the Harkin Institute. Now, when Senator Harkin announced he was retiring and everything was being moved from Washington, D.C. back to Iowa, we were able to bring back 800 boxes of documents, 2.5 terabytes of electronic data, and then one very, very popular popcorn machine that we used every day to make popcorn in our office in Washington, D.C. for constituents or whoever wanted to stop by to get it. Those 800 boxes are in the midst of being processed. Many of them are papers that are open for research and open for the public to come and take a look at, or for those writing books or K-12 students doing History Day projects to be able to find out more information. And those 2.5 terabytes of electronic data represents, probably about 1.6, 1.7 million 3.5-inch floppy disk, if you remember those hard floppy disks. Now, at the Institute, we have 4 policy areas in which we work. We understand that over 40 years of being in Congress, Senator Harkin had a lot of things that were of really high interest to him, but we really needed to focus our work. And so with that, we decided to focus our initial work and research on people with disabilities, wellness and nutrition, labor and employment, and retirement security. Each one of these policy areas has its own advisory group of experts known both nationally and internationally for their work in these fields and their expertise. They each also have leaders who work here at the Institute who help us to move that policy forward. And last but not least, the goal is to have each one of these policy areas have its own signature event each year where we can talk about the research we're doing in collaborations with others around the world as we look to improve the lives of many people affected in these policy areas. The first I'll talk about is wellness and nutrition. Of course, because I'm talking both about legacy and the research we're doing, it's important for us to take a look at what's happened in the past and then where we are going forward. And in wellness and nutrition, Senator Harkin was known for the Prevention and Public Health Fund, the Affordable Care Act from when he was the chair of the Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions Committee, support for the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, and his leadership in smoking cessation. And now we focus on things like the intersection of disability with wellness nutrition. The healthcare disparities of pregnant women with disabilities would be one of those things. We work on what we call the Harkin on Wellness report, which identifies the best of the um, programs that cities and companies and um, communities are doing in order to find best ways to engage better health for their citizens or their employees or those who live within their boundaries. In labor and employment, it's the same. We remember Senator Harkin as the chair of the Health Committee working on collective bargaining efforts, championing labor and employment rights, ending child labor in many places abroad. And now we continue to do that focus as we look at childcare and the effects of inadequate childcare on the labor market as our continued research in labor and employment. In retirement security, Senator Harkin back then worked in Congress to protect public retirement plans and strengthen private retirement plans. As part of the ACA negotiations, he championed the rights of all to have life-saving treatments, and he made prescription medications more affordable in many places, saving Medicare beneficiaries millions of dollars. And for that, he was recognized as a retirement security superhero by the Pension Rights Center. And we're continuing to do many of those looks at public and private pensions on understanding safety nets like Social Security and what to do to help people to be able to retire and leave the workforce in dignity. And our last area is in disability. And many folks know about Senator Harkin's work in the realm of disability, particularly because of the ADA and the IEDA, and then later the ADA amendments. But it all began with his brother, Frank, who is seen here. And Frank lost his hearing at a very early age. And Senator Harkin always felt like his brother could do more. And Frank left to go to school at what was then called the Iowa School for the Deaf and Dumb. And it was a moment in Senator Harkin's life that resonates throughout his entire career, particularly in talking about the rights of persons with disabilities and his work with the disability community. So we think back to those former pieces of legislation to also include the Television Decoder Act and many, many others that I named before. And now we have research fellows who are in the US and in China and a couple of other places who are working on many of the policy initiatives we currently have at the Harkin Institute, to include our largest initiative, which focuses on employment. We began back in 2016 to work on what's called the Harkin International Disability Employment Summit. And it's because in retirement, Senator Harkin wanted to still work on that policy issue. He's felt like the one place that the ADA had not reached its fuller potential is in economic self-sufficiency for people with disabilities. And we wanted to bring together corporations, micro enterprises, government entities, along with funders and self-advocates to talk about ways that we could better employ people with disabilities around the world. And we've been set off on that course ever since. And that really leads me to how we became connected to Griffin Hammis and VCU and working on this particular project. But before I get into the project itself, I just wanted to talk really briefly about public policy making. I've had a really blessed experience to have worked in local, state, and federal government, advising elected officials, writing public policy, helping to implement public policy, writing the rules that came from laws that had been enacted. And it's really important that when we think about public policy making itself, we understand that there's a lot of give and take that occurs. And that's between the policymakers as they are negotiating their work in the House and Senate floors, whether it be a legislature or in Congress. It is working with those subject matter experts out in the field who do the work and see the impacts every day. It's working with those agency leaders and implementers who have to actually create and do the things that the law has pushed them to do. And so that good public policy means that when done well, you've collaborated with all those entities. You've heard the voices of the people impacted by the work. You've talked to the people who influence the legislation, and you're building something that has created this opportunity to make positive change and for the good. So good public policy brings all those things into effect. It also means thinking through what we call the 4 Ps, which is policy, politics, process, and people. And within that, we have to think through um, all of those in order to get to the finish line of getting to good public policy. So thinking through the policy itself, just the legislation and where we're trying to go, the politics of the time and of the people who are involved in making the decision, the process, how are we going to get it passed, how are we going to get the rule changed, how are we going to get the law updated, and then the people. And it's really connecting with the people who are impacted and who have something to say and giving them a voice as well in the process. And these all create good public policy. We also think about um, implicit bias in how we create policy, and particularly in going from the legislation or the law and moving into the implementation and how those particular policies are put into place. When we talk about policy, we sometimes are talking about legislation, and sometimes we're talking about rules and regulations and interpretations of those laws in order to create standards or some sort of plan of action for entities to use to meet the law and fulfill its legislative intent. And then there's the perception of policy, um, and and looking at things from many different angles in order to understand how it might impact someone's life, how it might be heard and seen, and how it might be best implemented in the future. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the project research that we've been working on, and particularly the Harkin Institute's role in it. Um, our project goal was to conduct a review of existing state VR self-employment policy. And we wanted to be able to present the ways that we can better facilitate self-employment and talk about any barriers that we see in existence in terms of how the different states are implementing its policy on self-employment. We looked at 78 public vocational rehabilitation programs, so that includes the U.S. territories. And of the 78 offices, 90% of their policies were reviewed in this process. And this was all obtained through public search with our partners. And so these are the things that are out there. This is what's publicly seen in terms of information available and what those agencies have put out to its constituents and potential constituents about what types of things are allowed and how something like self-employment would be implemented within their regions or territories. I found this is interesting. These are words that kind of stand out at a word cloud from those used in VR policy and through our research. And you see things like must and assessment and funding, and cost stands out as well, income, resources, IPE, financial, all things that kind of rose to the top in terms of what is viewed as repetitive and sometimes as necessary or implemented as necessary within each of these policies. Always just found a good word cloud nice for the visualization of many of the words that we put into the larger documents. And so this one does not disappoint either. So why are we reviewing self-employment policy? Well, the Bureau of Labor Statistics has put out some stats that says that the percentage of self-employed persons with an unincorporated business was 6%, and those with a disability were at 11%. Um, but the successful VR closures remain around 1.7% of total successful closures. So as we reviewed the policies, it was important to look at various pieces of policy that might be impacting access to self-employment for all VR customers. You know, like I told you earlier, our thought is that we want to increase the rate of employment for people with disabilities around the world, and particularly in the US. And so trying to make sure we can understand what might be limiting some of the opportunities for people with disabilities in terms of employment, and understanding that employment is a range of things to include self-employment. In our work, we tend to focus on competitive integrated employment, but we want to make sure that all avenues are as equally wide open and available to people with disabilities no matter where they live in our country. And Senator Harkin has challenged us to double the employment rate for people with disabilities. And in order to achieve that goal, self-employment must be considered and accessible employment as an avenue for people with disabilities. So the 2019 top 5 performing states in status 26 closures are listed here. So for the general agencies, you'll see in the left column, it is Hawaii at 15.5%, to Mississippi with 10.5%, Colorado, Maine, and followed by New Mexico down at 5.3%. And for blind agencies, you got Nebraska at the top with 20.5%, followed by Vermont at 17.2%, and then Florida, Oregon, and finally Washington State at 9.2%. But remember, in 2019, only 1.7% of successful VR closures were in self-employment. And again, this is why we wanted to study self-employment in this particular research. So the RSA 911 data for 2019 shows that the majority of self-employment closures are primarily white males with some education. And so one of our thoughts in looking at this was, how can we increase accessibility for all VR customers? And policy is often a compass for counselors in service delivery. And so what are we missing? How can we help to raise some of the numbers that are particularly low compared to others? And how are we engaging in this? Are there biases that need to be considered and thought through as we look through this data and determine how people are implementing self-employment programs in their states and territories? So for the self-employment policy goals, the first is to ensure parity of access to self-employment. And that's regardless of that client's background or location or whatever financial resources they might have or any support needs they might have. The second is to allow for necessary support to explore self-employment. So that includes help to identify or refine their business concepts, help with conducting market research, and then the support for developing and writing a business plan, because we all know that anyone who starts a business has many resources around them, and it's not just one singular entrepreneur who is creating all of these different aspects to the creation of their business. And then the third goal is to make funding determinations on reasonable and consistent criteria, just as it would for wage employment. So with that in mind and those self-employment policy goals as kind of our guide star, we wanted to look at a few areas that impact access. And so the first is assessments. And so in doing our review of each of the states and territories, information that we could find publicly available, we've seen that the use of standard evaluations to identify a customer's skills and abilities or aptitude could be limiting, could be quite limiting. And so The results of this are yet to come out, but I think one of the things that we are seeing is that the use of assessments, while helpful in many ways, can also hurt and hinder people with disabilities from being able to have a viable career. The standardized assessments oftentimes have some bias to them, and they prematurely cut out some individuals, in many cases, who are able to do things like self-employment, because it asks things that limit the client, or it precludes them from moving into that next step because of things like experience in that particular area that they might want to work in or have a business in, or education. And so I think that one of the things that might come out of this review of the assessments is that they may bump someone out of um, the opportunity to achieve a more viable career than what the system puts them into. And that's because of a desire, obviously, to streamline and to move someone through the system to get them to employment. But I think that the assessment feature should have viability also in terms of how it actually helps someone to understand what they're capable of, and being more open to understanding aptitude than it is for prior skill or prior experience. And so we're going to do a deep dive into assessments, and that's really important for us because we don't necessarily know whether or not an assessment in itself or by itself would be something that an agency should lean on. The second is funding limits, and that's limits placed on the funding that it could include a cap or some sort of tier-based funding, or only offering a percentage of funds needed to that particular client as they go through their journey to self-employment. And so in reviewing the different states and doing a comparison of what states offer versus other states, will give us a greater sense of why some numbers might be higher than others in terms of their ability to close. And then match requirements, requiring that customer or client to provide a financial or in-kind contribution to secure funding, or will it count as a match requirement? Some states have different requirements and different definitions of what they consider a match. And so looking through and reviewing that as well. Next set of things in access is the VR funding restrictions. And so we're looking at this because those restrictions place parameters on the types of businesses that are allowable for funding in some cases, and trying to understand both the reasoning and maybe the historical context behind why particular businesses over others, or types of businesses, I should say. The fifth, IPE self-employment requirements, and those are the requirements prior to writing a self-employment goal in the IPE. So, what are the boxes that need to be checked? Each state is different, or in some cases, it might not be boxes to be checked; it could be hurdles. And so, how do we describe the ease of nature for some to get to that point to write a self-employment goal, and the almost insurmountable task for others depending on where they live? Next is the business feasibility requirements. And these are the checklists or the prescribed practices that have to be complete to identify if business is feasible. And again, just like many of these others, it's all very subjective to each agency and how they are implementing the self-employment policy, and what their rules might be in terms of doing it. Also subject to the individuals who might be assigned to that particular VR customer, and what their vision and view of self-employment is, and what that means for whether or not they can conduct a business and if that business plan is feasible for the individual. And then the last set that we're looking at are the business plan requirement itself. And does it allow for various sizes of businesses? And a business plan creativity, does it allow for that with a full-fledged business plan versus a business canvas? And what types of flexibilities are there in terms of what's actually required? Again, it's subject to the folks who are in charge of that particular area and what they're going to require of their VR customers in order for them to have access to self-employment. And so what are the business plan requirements? And you'll see compare and contrast amongst the states in that as well. And then as we wind down, the next would be the closure requirements centered around earning a certain wage by a certain date in order for that to be closed. And then last but not least, the contractors and fee structure, and how does the state contract with community partners or community rehabilitation providers around self-employment, and what some states are doing versus others. I think we'll be able to, in many parts of this, highlight things that we consider good practices and highlight the things that might be the hindrances or the hurdles that we see to greater access for people with disabilities to access self-employment as one of their viable employment goals. Overall, the project itself is going to do compare and contrast, as I told you, within those areas that were listed. There's going to be some deeper dives in finance and in policy implementation. I think there'll be a lot of opportunity for the good policy and the good interactions that many of the states have had to come forward and be able to give a good example of all the things that are happening across the country, and then how we might implement more of those things. I think that the paper itself will be a short teaser to a larger paper that's going to have even more recommendations and guidance based on our review of the state and territories policies. Most importantly, in thinking about implementation and good public policy, we want to be able to take that legislative intent of the idea of self-employment and make sure that the opportunity is available wholesale to people with disabilities across the country. And during this review, it's really an opportunity to update and revamp and be creative and to think of ways to go from where we are now to where we would like to be in the future. And so our recommendations that will come from our review and compare and contrast will push toward that end. I look forward to your questions about our work and about this research. The papers are coming along really well, and we are excited to be able to explore this with all of our friends in VR and on behalf of people with disabilities who are seeking to have the option of self-employment as well. Like I said, we want to make sure that economic self-sufficiency is high on the list for all of us, including our public policymakers and those who work in public and private entities that touch the lives of people with disabilities. And so our work, our review in public policy analysis and making those recommendations will center on that being our guide star, economic self-sufficiency, and the idea that there is a job out there for everyone. Thank you very much.